Hi, my name is Lisa Whitehouse, and I'm the artist behind Whitehouse Art. For this class, I'm going to be walking you guys through how to paint a bumblebee from start to finish. As an artist, I specialize in a type of watercolor called loose watercolor, and that's where I allow the paints to splash, splatter, and drip all throughout the page. It's a lot of fun to do. I'm going to give you guys all the supplies you need to create this bumblebee. I'll also give you some tips and tricks that you can use to paint on your own as well. This class is extremely beginner friendly. I'll help you with the sketching out of your subject and layer by layer take you through how to paint the bumblebee. That way you get an end result that you can be extremely proud of. Alright, so I recommend starting out with a good watercolor paper. I like to use 140-pound paper. It doesn't allow for a lot of warping, and I find it's the most common weight of paper you can find. For starting out, you don't necessarily need to tape around the edges, but if you want to achieve a nice flat paper, you can masking tape the edges down to your work surface or to a stained or coated piece of wood. Next, I recommend a nice light shaded pencil for sketching out your subject. A 2B works great, as well as some brushes. So there's sometimes a temptation to start out with an inexpensive starter pack of watercolor paintbrushes, but those paintbrushes tend to degrade very quickly. So I recommend spending about $5 per brush and getting a variety of brushes that you can play around with and get comfortable with to see what you like best to work with. For today, I'm going to be using a liner brush, an angled brush, as well as a small flat brush. I personally love to work with tube paints. You can reuse them over and over again as long as you continue to re-wet them and stop them from bleeding into each other. So for today's painting, we're going to be using lamp black, cadmium yellow, and yellow ochre. If you start out with a student grade set of watercolor paints that comes with a variety of colors, most of them will contain a bright yellow, a yellow ochre, as well as a black. So that's a great way to get started and play around with some different colors. As far as a palette, you can get a simple palette from your art supply store. I personally love to use an ice cube tray. After years of working with watercolors, I find they stop the colors from bleeding into each other, and it just works great. You can add quite a bit of water and work with them over and over again without your paints bleeding together and turning sort of a muddy shade of brown. As far as water goes, I like to have a water tray that has two compartments. That's because I like to have a dirtier water for when I initially wash my brush, as well as a lighter color water for doing the washes. A nice clear wash is what you really need with a painting like the bumblebee. That's because the bumblebee uses a lot of yellow, and you wouldn't want your black water getting into your yellow. If you don't want to invest in a water tray, not to worry at all. Simple 2 glasses or 2 mason jars does the same thing and works great. And last but not least, I like to have a roll of paper towel handy. This is going to be your best friend when you're initially starting, and it still is for me today. That's because every time you add too much water or make a small mistake, it's easy to wipe it up with paper towel. And I find with watercolor, they can sometimes get a little bit messy, and paper towel does a great job of keeping your workspace clean. So that's everything you need to get started today, and let's get painting. Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be taking you guys through how to paint a bumblebee. We're going to be painting this little guy right here in loose watercolor style. So loose watercolor is where you allow the colors to splatter, splash, bleed, and run on the page. I've supplied you guys with a file to allow you to trace the bumblebee for those who aren't comfortable with sketching it out. But if you are comfortable with sketching it out, go ahead and take a crack at it. A bumblebee is a great place to start. I like to start with a kidney bean shape. So I draw the bee out using a nice oval with a slight bend in it. Keep the bum a little bit bigger than the head and draw it in the center of the page. Once you have your outline, you can begin dividing up the bumblebee into sections. So we have the head section. We have the middle section. This is where the yellow is going to go. We have the next section that's black. We have one more yellow section. And then this last part we add a little point on the end for his bum. Next we add the wings. So the wings go straight back. And make sure when you're drawing it to keep it nice and light. But if for whatever reason you're the type of person who likes to draw it a little bit darker, that is no problem at all, because you can always go back and erase some of those lines after the fact to lighten them up before you add color. I like to keep my drawings nice and loose because we can add the detail with the paint. So where the eye goes, you're going to be wanting to leave white. So make sure you draw a nice line showing where the eye is going to be. With watercolor, it's important to mark out your whites because with watercolors, you can always add color, but you can't take it away. So there is no white paint with watercolor, so we just make sure we don't add any paint there. So before we get started on adding the color, we're just going to make sure we erase any of the darker lines. The places where you press down just a little bit too hard when you're drawing. I have a tendency to do that sometimes. So I like to keep a white eraser close by just to lighten some of those lines before I get started. With watercolors, you can also erase some of those lines after the fact, but it's always easy to do it beforehand. So now this little guy is ready for some color. So today we're going to be using 3 different colors. We're going to be using cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, and lamp black. I like to have a mix of 2 yellows because it adds some of that dimension and layer that you see so often with watercolors. I just find it a little bit more interesting. For the black, I really like the lamp black because you get some of those strong black pigments, but it allows you to add more water and get some of the gray washes as well. So today we're going to be using a style called loose watercolor. With loose watercolor, you have a clear base, and then you allow your pigment to bleed throughout your clear water base. So first things first, we're going to get started with the background. Another little bit of background information is that with watercolors, you always want to work from lightest to darkest. So in this case, the background is the lightest color. So I'm going to go ahead and lay down a clear wash for the background and show you guys how to get started. So you want to have nice clear water in your water tray. And you want to start by adding that clear water all around, and be very loose with this. Keep your wrist nice and loose. Go up and around through the top of the head, making sure not to let too much of the paint bubble. So when you look at the painting sideways, you shouldn't see any bubbles of water. You should see a nice clear sheen. This will allow your yellow to bleed evenly and smoothly. So next we take a bit of cadmium yellow and we follow the perimeter of the face of the bee. So that is all around here. Being careful not to make it too even. It's nice to leave little white gaps that allow the watercolor to feel like it's been placed down in a more organic way. So with the wet on wet technique, you don't need to pull the paint out with the brush. You can just allow it to bleed naturally. So I like to add little spots of color throughout the clear water that then slowly find their way back to the head. So that's about all I would do for the cadmium yellow. Then I would grab a little bit of yellow ochre and go back to the head and add a little bit of points here and there just to add that dimension that I mentioned earlier. So that's all you would do for the first coat on the background in front of the face. Now we're going to move on to the back. So that is all along here. And everybody's painting is going to look a little bit different. You don't have to follow my lines exactly. It can be difficult, I know, to see on camera, some of the places where I allow the clear water to stop and start. But those details aren't so much as important as making sure that you follow the line of the bee. Don't worry about how far it goes necessarily, but just that it follows the outline of the bee. So we're going to take the cadmium yellow, let that follow here, and just like the front, we follow the perimeter of the bum to give the bee a bit more definition. In a next step, we're going to be adding some splatters, but for the first coat, all we're wanting to do is create a bit of that gradient in the background before we add the splatters. So that's going to have to completely dry before we can add those splatters. So next up is the body. We're going to start on the yellows of the body. So just like the background, you're going to be taking clear water and filling in the body. If you find that the background bleeds into the body, not to worry, that's perfectly okay with loose watercolor. I find when I'm painting, the body will often bleed into the background, and that's a look that I really like. In later steps, when we're adding the blacks, you'll find that you bring that definition back into the bumblebee. So with the body, just like the background, we're adding the color around the perimeter and allowing it to bleed into the center. And then we repeat the same step here. Adding clear water first, allowing some of the background to bleed into the body, and following the perimeter of that section. Keeping your wrist nice and loose allows you to leave some points blank, which further contributes to that loose watercolor look. So that's all we want for the body of the bee. Next up, we'll be adding the wings. So for this, once again, you want to keep your wrist nice and loose, and you want to just swipe some clear water through the wing up to the body. It's not important that you cover the entire wing, but that you allow some parts of white to show through. Then we just take a tiny bit of yellow and swipe it into the wing. We're trying to create a fast movement with the wing, so having these swipes of yellow help create that movement. So that's all we want to do for this layer on the wings and the body. So that's it for the first layer of the bumblebee. I find with watercolors it usually takes around 10 to 30 minutes for a layer to dry. I often have more than one painting on the go so that I avoid the temptation to overwork a painting before it's dry. With watercolor, we're always wanting to add more layers to add that dimension, and if there is a section of the body that you find isn't dark enough, it's better to let it dry and come back and add color in a second layer than to continue to work the first layer. So now we're going to let the painting dry. So now that the first coat is dry, we're going to go ahead and add a second coat of yellow. I find sometimes the yellow dries quite light on the first coat, so the second coat will just brighten it up. So for the second coat, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing we did for the first coat. You're going to go over the yellow with another coat of clear water. Don't be too concerned about following the pattern of the last coat of yellow, as sometimes having the different shades of yellow show through underneath can be a good thing. So all we're doing is following that line of the face again with a few dots outwards and letting it bleed once again. Then we're going back and doing the body again. So that's just a quick wash of clear water. And a bit more yellow. We want this bumblebee to be nice and bold. So the best way to achieve that is by going over the yellow twice with a good amount of color. For the second coat, you still want to allow some of those white spots to show through. That gives it that classic watercolor feel. And for the second coat on the wings, we're going to do another layer of clear water in lines like we did the first time, allowing some white to show through, except this time we're going to do a bit of yellow and a bit of gray. So that's just taking the tiniest little bit of your black and adding that over top of the yellow. With black, it's important to work slowly, as black can be very unforgiving. So you want to make sure you're adding just tiny amounts at a time so as not to overwhelm the painting. Something just like that. Then we go to the back and do one more layer back there. With watercolor, it's important to have patience while each layer dries. If I was to go and add the black right now, the black and the yellow would bleed into each other and it would become a very muddied painting. So once again, after you've added that yellow, you step back and let it dry again. Okay, so now that we've given our paintings time to dry and the yellow is quite nice and bright, it's time to move on to the black. I've had students tell me before that they're always a little nervous to work with black, and I want to reassure you there's nothing to be nervous about. Take your time, build up in layers slowly, and eventually you'll get that nice solid black that we're hoping to achieve. So with the black, like I said, the most important thing is to make sure that the rest of your painting is dry. If for whatever reason you didn't see a spot of the yellow that was still wet and it starts to bleed, just keep a paper towel nearby. Paper towel will be your friend for any mistakes. You can simply dab up the black from the yellow and your painting will be just fine. The nice part with loose watercolor is sometimes mistakes can end up being a great part of the painting. All right, so just like the yellow, we start on one side and work our way. For me, because I'm right-handed, I like to start on the left side and work my way to the right. So I'm going to start with the head with a nice clear water wash. Because we're working with black now, if your water's a little bit dirty, it's not as important. All right, so then we take black. And you want your black to be fairly saturated now. The best way to get your black to be fairly saturated is to massage your brush in the water and the pigment until the water becomes quite a thick layer of black. Then we take the tip of the brush. Now for me, I find the angle brush best for achieving this. But if you're more comfortable, you can also take a liner. And we just work our way around the perimeter, adding little hairs, making our little bumblebee nice and fuzzy. So we do this, just going around the outside, make them nice and fuzzy. And the black's going to be done in multiple layers until we get the right shade of black. So if you notice that it's starting to dry already a little bit gray, don't worry, you can continue to add the black until you get it nice and dark. It's important to leave out the little eye here, just a small oval where the eye should be. And then you keep adding the black. So I just keep working my way around. I like to leave some parts of the head a little lighter than others, so I might leave this patch a little lighter and allow the black to just move into it. Whereas around the eye, I might want to go a little bit darker. So just keep working your way around the head. And as it dries, it'll continue to lighten. And you'll notice that some parts might dry as you're working, and that's okay. Just sort of wave your brush around in hair-like strokes to fill those areas in. Oops. If you find a hair from the brush gets loose or a piece of paint gets on the painting, it's easy enough to just pick it up and place it on your paper towel. So this is almost at the level of darkness that I like to see. It will once again dry lighter, but when we go back and add some of that detail again at the end, it'll darken it up a little bit more. So now we're gonna move to the center of the body. So once again, nice clear wash over the center of the body, making sure to cover the whole body. Without any large pools of water, you can massage the pools of water into the rest of it so you have a nice thin sheen over that center of the body. And then we start again with the small strokes. And if you find that, like I said, if you find that when you're starting out you're a little bit slow and it starts to dry, not to worry, you can always go back and add a second coat of clear water once the first coat has dried. For this coat, the main thing is trying to get down a fairly quick wash of black. If you want to add some fine hairs on the last coat, that's totally doable. So don't worry too much about having all the little hairs be perfect. Just focus on filling the bee's body up with a nice black pigment. And you'll see I have white spots here. Those will fill in as it dries. You'll want to have some darker parts and some lighter parts. So then we can move to the next section. And the next section ties into that. The third section ties into the second section. So what I like to do is start up here, and then when I'm ready to connect the two, I simply lock into it, and this will bleed into the third part. And then we keep going. The reason I don't do all of this at one time is because it has a tendency to just dry too fast. So if you do it in two sections, it can allow you to take your time a little bit more. And for the bum of the bee, you just want to rinse out your brush and use just the tiniest bit of gray. Even the dirty water from your paintbrush would work for the bum. I'm noticing here that it's not drying quite as dark as I'd like, so I'm just going to go ahead while it's still wet and add just a little bit more. Sometimes it's a matter of just playing around until you get the right amount of darkness. And part of that is just learning to work with watercolor. So some of the stuff you're learning on this painting you can apply on your second bumblebee or on a butterfly. The key here is to learn the techniques that you can use to create as many bumblebees as you like. So that's it for the third coat. So now we're going to go ahead and let the black dry. And then for the final coat, we're going to be adding some of those details, the feet, the antennae, and then some of the other details in the wings, as well as the splatters that you see in a lot of my paintings. So let's let this dry and we'll go from there. So now that the black has had time to dry, we can see that it's lightened up quite a bit. Black often lightens up quite a bit into a shade of gray, and we're not really wanting the bumblebee to be gray. So what we're going to do is we're going to darken it with one more coat. So we're going to take the black, and just like with the second coat on the yellow, we're not going to worry that the black covers everything. You can allow some gray to show through to get that multi-dimensional feel that I had talked about before. So same thing, we're just going to go around and add some little hair strokes all the way around, allowing certain parts of the gray to show through, but just to darken it overall. So the goal with this coat isn't to be perfect, but to just darken it and allow some of the previous layer to shine through. So you can move quite quickly through this coat only because it doesn't have to be perfect. The goal is almost to make it less than perfect, because that's the beauty of loose watercolor. Okay, so once you have added a second coat of black, it's now time to add some of your details. So for that, I like to use the liner brush. You want to be always using the tip of your liner brush. So the key with that is not to press down too hard, to almost let the brush skip off the page in certain parts. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So for the antenna, you're gonna vibrate your hand slightly. So I'm allowing the brush to skip off the page so you don't have a solid line, but a bit of a broken line. In nature, the bumblebee would be moving fairly fast, so you wouldn't be able to see some of those details. And I like that to convey that through choppy lines. So we're gonna do a few little hairs here. And for the wings, you want to take the tip of your brush and once again just do a choppy line where parts of the wings you're showing and parts you're allowing the eye to fill in itself. So if I don't do a complete line, your eye has a tendency to see the line as complete regardless. So you can do the wings would also be moving really fast, so that's why I really don't like to fill them in too much. That's all I like to do on the wing. And then if you take a little bit of clear water and you just massage some of those lines a little bit with clear water, some of them get a little bit hazy. We don't want to show too much detail, so eliminating some of that detail with clear water helps give it that real loose feel. So that's all you're doing, is just taking clear water beside your thin lines and just massaging it a tiny bit just to break it up. So that's all I would do for the wings. And then I continue on, so drawing some hairs, taking your fine brush and just going around and adding just the odd little hair. Gives them that really fuzzy feel that we often associate with bumblebees. So not filling in the whole back, but just having a few little scraggly hairs to imply where he begins and ends. For the feet, it's the same thing as the antenna. They're not solid lines, but broken lines. They're a little bit thicker near the base of the bee, and then they taper to a little bit thinner. Then we take a little bit of black, and we just draw some hairs leading towards the bum. And then that's all we do for that. And sometimes if I notice I want to add a little more detail on the wings, now's the time to do it. Just holding the brush ever so lightly. And then adding a little more detail on the body. If it's still wet, that's okay. Some will be dry and some will be wet, so you'll be able to see some hairs and some will just bleed in to the water that you have down, and that's okay. This is a good time to go into the face and add some of those little details. I find on the last coat, I tend to be bouncing around a little bit all over the painting and just adding the right amount of detail. So I would consider that complete as far as the detail. So now I'm going to show you how to do splatters. And for lots of my students, I find the splatters are their favorite part. You can really have fun with it, but the key is to not go too crazy. I find if you work slowly with the dots, then you have a tendency to be more restrained. So what I'll do sometimes is I'll take quite a lot of water in my brush and a little bit of pigment, and then I'll just take my brush in one hand at the end, my finger with the other, and just tap it around the painting. And then I let that piece be for a bit. Then I tap a little bit on the body, a little bit over here, and let that piece be. Then we can move and grab a little bit of yellow ochre and do again in the back. And one thing that can be fun, because the bumblebee is flying into the air, is to do some that splatter away from the bee to imply that he's moving really fast. We can even take a little bit of the black and do some gray dots. Even on the body. Being careful not to add too many. The closer you go to the painting, the more control you're going to have over where the dots end up. So now I take a second and I'll look at the painting and decide, do I feel like it needs a little bit more? I do feel like it could use a little bit more in this area. There's a lot of blank spaces, and I feel like a few more dots would be kind of fun. So I take more yellow and just add them here. I use one hand, but you guys are welcome to, as you're figuring it out, use two hands. I often recommend using a scrap piece of paper to test out the tapping technique before actually doing it on your painting. It's totally up to you. It's just whatever you're more comfortable with. Because sometimes it can take a little bit of time to figure out how much water to use to have the paint let go. And if you get a bit of yellow on the bumblebee himself, on the black parts, that works too. It'll probably dry to mostly black, but you'll still see a tiny bit of yellow. And last but not least, we sign it. And voila! Your bumblebee is all done. I hope you enjoyed this class. All right, so now that we're done and your painting's had a full 24 hours to dry, I recommend taking a look over and just making sure there's no pencil lines. If you do see any, you can take a white eraser and simply erase them. With watercolor, the nice part is you can erase through it. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have a moment to leave me feedback, I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message. Have a great day.